and that we have some exciting,
I've
um,
started the recording.
great,
Okay.
thank you. That's the official recording.
Okay.
Some gatherings planned at upcoming conferences. So at ISSBD this summer, and also later in the summer at the European Association for Research on Adolescence, there will be another get together. And so if you're going to conferences in the future, you can also think, oh, maybe this is an opportunity for DevSCA to plan something. It's a great opportunity for people to learn about DevSCA, join the group. Um, and otherwise, I just sent an email including a request to vote for our logo. And we already have around 30 people who have voted, which is exciting. But we want to get as many people's opinions as possible, also, so we can include the logo at things like our conference events. So please do share your opinion via that link. Okay, otherwise, I will hand it over to Tal, who will help host this session and invited our wonderful speakers today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have one of our speaker series events centered around like how can we incorporate climate action and advocacy into our different spheres of our lives as educators, like our teaching. So we're so fortunate to get to feature two different examples of projects that have been incorporated in actual undergraduate classes for psychology undergraduate psychology classes, which is we're super grateful to hear from Professor Ron Friedman, who's going to be sharing first. And then we're also going to hear from PhD student Pauline Brewer afterwards. On the two coasts of the US, in New York and in California. It is early for Pauline, so thank you for joining us this morning. Okay, so I want to give us a good amount of time to hear about each of the things that you've done in your classes. And then what we'll probably do is each person will share a bit. And then afterwards, we'll have a bit of a guided, prompted discussion. And then we'll also invite in everyone from the audience to chime in and ask any questions or add comments. So, without further ado, I am delighted to welcome Professor Ron Freeman to share with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Please take it away.
Okay, sure. I'm just gonna see if I can get my slides going. Let's see. Can you see this? Let me see. Get this going.
Looks good.
Okay. Um, all right, slides are good. Yeah. Okay.
Awesome.
So, yeah, thanks for inviting me. I have to admit, I'm kind of embarrassed to be presenting here because I'm not a developmental psychologist. Tal knows, I did work with a famous developmental psychologist, Carol Dweck, in graduate school. But as I was telling Tal, I think I was probably the worst graduate student she ever had. And despite my best efforts, I never published anything with her, after like 5 years or something like this. With the exception of two little papers that I published on a side a couple of years ago. I'm also not an environmental psychologist, and my research is mostly on music cognition and perception. That said, I do care a lot about the environmental crisis. I do feel a lot of grief, a lot of anger about it. On a daily basis. And I had spent many years involved in environmental advocacy, including on plastic waste reduction, regulating or really banning transportation of fracked crude oil, fossil fuel divestment, and so forth. And in the course of doing all that work, it occurred to me at some point that one of the best ways to make a difference might be kind of right under my nose that, I was the director somehow of an undergraduate psychology program with like 2,000 majors and minors in which students could literally take a dozen courses and never hear the terms climate change or environmental justice. And that didn't sit well with me, particularly because we have a very diverse student body at the University of Albany, and we have thousands of undergraduates who are members of historically disadvantaged minority groups, often from working class backgrounds. Many others come from economically challenged rural areas upstate. And so, we're talking about kids from communities that face many challenges. And among those have been and continue to be that they're relatively vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. So, despite some reservations about my lack of scholarly expertise on this subject, when the opportunity recently came about for me to develop a senior capstone course of my own, I took this leap and I developed one on climate and environmental psychology. In case any of you are thinking of developing a course of this type, I did want to quickly point out two resources that were particularly helpful for me and made it easier for me. One, Elise Amo, I don't know her, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and her colleagues wrote a textbook that I ended up adopting, which reviews a lot of the current psychological literature on this topic for an undergraduate audience. The instructor materials also offer a number of kind of thoughtful ideas for in-class activities. And then second, I found a website called Go Figure, Teaching Psychology for Sustainability, which was developed and managed by one of the textbook co-authors, Britton Scott. And this offers a whole bunch of links to relevant journal articles, lecture topics, and perhaps most importantly, for those of you considering developing your own class, it offers a large set of syllabi that other faculty had generously posted for their own classes on environmental and conservation psychology, and from which I quite generously borrowed. Anyway, after studying these and other materials, I developed my own course structure, which would rely on a combination of textbook and primary source readings on topics, including psychological barriers to climate action, the roots of climate denial, current thinking regarding how to combat climate misinformation and disinformation. Some other topics I really enjoy talking about, like the psychology of meat eating and a great deal about activism. So, perceptions of environmentalists, scientist activism. One theme that I emphasize throughout is environmental justice, and we do spend a lot of time talking about issues such as psychological consequences of living in fence line communities, hidden costs of conservation initiatives to indigenous populations, psychologically and otherwise, and ethical issues regarding the impact of human activities on, other living things. All right, let me finally get to what you'd invited me to discuss today. So another key element of the course is that it involves students working on an individual behavior change project over the course of the semester in which they form a plan and take action to reduce their personal environmental footprint. Now, again, this is not an original idea. Variants of it were integrated into the courses of many other professors whose syllabi I had looked through and who should probably be here talking to you, not me. Anyway, I thought this would be a great idea for, well, a number of reasons, to raise student consciousness about their personal contributions to the environmental crisis, empowering them to find ways of making a positive change, helping them recognize the tremendous psychological, economic, practical obstacles to living more sustainably. And outside of that, I just want to point out that in these types of senior capstone classes in our major, we aim to provide opportunities for them to develop and apply their information literacy, advanced writing, oral discourse skills. So this is something to keep in mind as I go through the details here. So again, just to give you a sense of what the project involves, in its current incarnation, it involves 8 steps divided into 3 stages. So in the first stage, I tell them that, the first thing they have to do is identify a way of changing their routine personal behavior that has a negative impact on environmental sustainability. And the task of changing the behavior that they choose should be difficult enough to challenge them. And it should also involve persistent effort over several weeks. So not just one or a few isolated actions. So, going down to the basement to change a couple of bulbs to LEDs, that's not going to cut it. The projects they choose have typically involved things like, reducing trash, like, avoiding bottled beverages or plastic packaging, reducing indoor water use, like, some of them, like, wash or dry clothing by hand, greening their commute. So, using public transportation, walking, biking rather than driving, or using Uber, which they use to an astonishing amount, reducing or eliminating their consumption of meat and or dairy, growing or preparing types of food at home that they might otherwise have to go out and travel to purchase. So baking their own bread, growing, herbs that they use for cooking, composting their food scraps, avoiding different types of paper products and the like. So I provide kind of, the relatively commonplace examples like this in the instructions, but I note that many other possibilities would be acceptable and that they should feel free to suggest other options. And some of the ideas they come up with are creative and sometimes even like a little bit poignant. Like, so for instance, last semester, I had this student who grew up in a rural area of the Dominican Republic and where they had no running water. And so she basically decided to go back to her childhood practice of what she called like a baño de cubeta, is like this kind of filling this like large bucket with like room temperature water and then kind of pre-lather and rinse yourself off with a pitcher. So, so she was doing this for, whatever, 4 or 5 weeks. I emphasize for the students that their project grades won't be based on successfully changing their behavior, but rather is focused on their effort and their analysis. That basically there's a lot that you can learn from the ways in which a well-intentioned project can go awry. And again, I encourage them to pick a behavior that they genuinely care about and hope to change. And I hope there's at least one. After getting my approval for the idea, which could take some back and forth between us, students write a memo laying out their specific goals for changing the behavior. And here they need to do a couple of things, basically to detail how much of a change in behavior they're hoping to accomplish, to describe precisely how they plan to implement the change over the coming several weeks, usually 4 to 5 weeks. List situations that they anticipate may interfere, changing the behavior, list short-term and long-term pros and cons of changing the behavior, and describe any concrete plans they have for dealing with obstacles. And at that point, they begin implementation. And while they do so, I ask that they keep a personal change diary. And so essentially at the end of each day during the implementation period, they're to make a note as to whether they succeeded at their goal or not. And if they haven't been successful on a given day, they're to note the obstacles that they encountered and the ways they tried to deal with them. At the end of the 4 week implementation period, I have students write an essay reflecting on their experience and attempting to change their behavior and addressing a couple of things. So one, whether they were successful in accomplishing the goal or not, noting if there were any strategies that were effective in making progress toward the goal, describing with the aid of the change diary that I mentioned just a moment ago, some of the obstacles that they encountered to attaining their goal, if any, discussing whether they think the behavior changes are going to last beyond the time frame for the project and why, and if they were to continue the behavior change project, how might their strategies and goals for that project differ now in real life, so to speak, and then to discuss what, if anything, they learned from the experience overall, and giving them the option to provide concrete suggestions to me, to improve, to tweak the assignment if they didn't find it useful. In the second stage of the project, the students now conduct an online literature search to identify scientific research relevant to their behavior change problem. Here in the background, I use some class time to show them how to use databases like PsycInfo to find peer-reviewed journal articles reporting research aimed at evaluating strategies for changing a behavior that's the same as or hopefully similar to the one they tried to change. To clarify, I do let them know that it's acceptable for them to choose, one or more articles that are not specifically aimed at their behavior, so to speak. So for example, even if their project was focused on, reducing water consumption. It's still possible that articles on reducing energy consumption or meat consumption or littering and so forth might have important implications for getting people to conserve water. Next, students are going to write a paper briefly describing the methods and conclusions of the articles that they identified and also addressing the extent to which the articles help them account for the experiences that they had and the obstacles that they encountered in completing their projects. And given their now this new knowledge of the literature, I asked them to address whether they now believe that they could redesign their project in some way to make it more effective. This assignment, again, gives them the opportunity to review with them some of the basics of APA style, for instance, for in-text citations, for reference sections, and so forth. And I have it up there on the slides, but I want to note that after evaluating their initial submission, I also give students written feedback, typically revolving around the selection of their articles and writing style and so forth, which is frankly a kind of a rare opportunity for our majors, this large state school. They typically are attending very large lecture classes that involve fairly minimal writing. And then in the final stage of the project, have students give around, say, 15-minute oral presentations regarding their projects and in class, so to one another. And here they're describing the projects, they're summarizing their experiences, they're discussing any obstacles that they encountered, basically introducing their classmates to the academic literature that they discovered relevant to the behavior that they tried to change. As little writing experience as our students often have, they often have even fewer opportunities to develop their oral presentation skills. So I provide PowerPoint templates. It's like, here's a couple of slides in the template I give them, and general tips on preparing presentations like this, which I review in class as well. And I can share these materials with anyone who's interested. Although looking at that slide with me with the organic Brussels sprouts, I'll probably leave that one out, and we should probably cut that out of the recording. During the class presentations, I also try to maintain active involvement by the audience by having them prepare questions and comments for one another, which they submit online, and which I sometimes curate and share, so they get feedback from one another. I also use class time for a group discussion of the project, soliciting critical input about the project itself, suggestions for change, and also trying to kind of do a synthesis to try to draw conclusions regarding what we can do better in terms of climate action. What else? You'd asked me to talk about a couple of takeaways. In terms of the positive side, I asked students, we just talked about this yesterday in the class I'm running now. It seems that they do appreciate doing the project in stages over the course of the semester, and beyond helping with time management, it also seems to provide kind of like a personal context for a lot of the literature that we discuss over the course of the semester. I've also been happy to see that it seems to kind of open students' eyes to the, practical or systemic obstacles to sustainable behavior that, and as they encounter these kind of firsthand, when they are doing things like preparing, or purchasing vegan food, which can be, expensive and time consuming at least at first, or when they're forced to adjust their schedules to accommodate taking public transportation, or when they're drying their clothes on a rack or a line indoors in their often cramped apartments with like four other roommates in the city. Many students have told me that they have retained at least some of the changes that they've made after the project wrapped up, including, like I mentioned, dietary changes, things like composting, reductions of plastics use, and that they've appreciated discussing the various projects amongst themselves over the course of the semester, and they sometimes kind of influence one another to make lifestyle changes, to change habits. So, for instance, cutting back on mindlessly driving small distances or ordering takeout food, or some folks saying, even they grew up New York City, and they go out for fast food and just kind of leave the trash on the sidewalk. That was just the way the way things were done. Whether these changes are durable for these senior college students at a time of major transition in their lives, I don't have the answers to tell you, but it appears that it is a positive experience overall. Some of them, have described it as kind of, enlightening, eye-opening. In terms of the downsides, one of the biggest cons, I guess you could say, of the project is not about the project per se, but it's the fact that I only have the resources to implement it with a handful of majors. Like right now, I have about 19 students. So it sometimes goes to about 25 to 30. Implemented with a handful of majors, just as about they're about to graduate. And so I'm interested in ways of implementing maybe modified versions of this that might be appropriate for larger enrollment courses. Like I've taught courses like intro psychology, research methods, social psychology, and the like. And that's something I welcome your input on as well. And perhaps the biggest problem is that it squarely centers students' efforts on making personal lifestyle changes as opposed to engaging in collective action. Now, I'm grateful, and we have to be grateful, for any and every change along those lines. But I do hope, I mean, I don't think so because I spend enough time talking about collective action in the class, but I hope I'm not inadvertently encouraging students to over-focus on individual action as opposed to investing their efforts in collective organizing to make the systemic, I mean, the political, the economic changes that are fundamental to addressing this really horrible crisis that we're facing right now. And for that reason, I'm looking forward to hearing Pauline's talk, and I'm not going to take up any more time so we can hear more from Pauline. And thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Maybe we can give a quick round of applause, and then I'm going to spotlight Pauline here. And we are going to have time for like questions all together at the end after we've gotten to hear from both of you. Thank you so much, Ron. And I'm going to turn it over to Pauline to describe the project that you've been involved in.
Thank you. I'm going to try to set up, let's see if I can do this. Let's see. Okay, you're seeing the full picture, right? The full
Yeah, it looks great.
Amazing. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Pauline. Here we go. All right. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. I am a PhD student at UC San Diego, but before I get into the topic that I prepared and that I'm going to talk about today, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background because I'm also not a developmental psychologist. I grew up in Germany and did my master's degree in clinical psychology at the University of Münster. And nowadays I'm quite far away from home here in San Diego at UCSD, where I work together with Dr. Adam Aron and Tal on some projects and on the question of what drives people to join collective action on the climate crisis. And so imagine that you're starting your freshman year in undergrad and you just arrived on campus, there's a lot going on. You're worried about making friends, about which classes you might want to take, what your career might look like in the future, and you may be worried about money and how you're going to pay for college. And let's say that you're interested in psychology, you want to eventually declare a psychology major. And so you're taking this class called the Psychology of the Climate Crisis. And in this class, you learn about global warming, about planetary boundaries and climate science, about the bitter projections we're facing regarding our very near future, about the insufficient actions that are being taken by or not being taken by governments and kind of politicians worldwide. And you see these pictures about climate impacts that are already happening around the world. And so how would that make you feel? And your intuition probably says that these students won't feel too great. And in fact, we asked them to reflect on their feelings while actually teaching this class here at UCSD and kind of collect some written responses of how all of this material makes them feel. And some of the emotions that they mention in the class include feeling hopeless, feeling frustrated, anxious, sad, angry, ashamed, afraid, resignated, and disappointed. And there's research showing that educators often try to avoid these negative emotions in students and that they use different strategies to do so and to make sure that these emotions aren't as bad or don't even arise. And so, for instance, students or educators might try to provide kind of more objective facts, more scientific facts, instead of kind of emotionally loaded contexts. They might try to neutralize negative emotions by not expressing them themselves, or if students express them, by kind of not going too much into depth. Or educators might be trying to actively replace negative emotions with positive ones. So if students express feeling very angry, they might try to kind of engage in discussion and motivate them to turn this anger into hope. And there's a very well-written and short paper by Kornav and Uttam Chandani that explains very nicely that while that's very understandable, trying to kind of circumvent and replace negative emotions, that by replacing them, we actually lose their analytic value. Because if students learn about the state of the world and the trajectories that we're facing, what needs to be done to change this trajectory and all the political and social barriers that are standing in the way, then feeling hopeless and angry and disillusioned is actually a sign of having understood the bigger picture and of learning. And so while it's very tempting for educators and activist groups and kind of people in general to try to reduce these negative emotions, avoiding them might actually strip young people of the ability to really kind of take in the bigger picture, make sense of the bigger picture, and might make them kind of very optimistic and hopeful for the wrong reasons. And now I don't want to say that negative emotions are always great. And of course, there's the risk of kind of these negative emotions turning into resignation and apathy, which we don't want. But maybe there's a way of kind of teaching about the poly crisis, the climate crisis, the social crisis, and while doing so, allowing these undergrad students to really see and feel the whole picture, while also kind of giving them a sense of agency. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And this question of how to teach young people about the climate crisis is really important, especially here at UCSD, because we actually now have a general education requirement where every incoming undergrad student has to take one course on climate change in some sort of way before they're allowed to graduate, which, by the way, is a demand that was actually won by a student activist organization here on campus. So here's an example of kind of collective local action that won something. And I believe that I saw that at UC Davis, they might have implemented this or are about to implement this very recently as well. And so with all of these kind of, over this new requirement, the question really becomes all of these classes that the students have to take, what should they look like and what should they learn and what do they take away from them? And so the approach that we're taking is actually embedding collective action into the class that we're teaching. And I thought it might be nice to share an excerpt of my advisor's syllabus for the class that's currently going on, which states that the philosophy of the instructor is that in this class, we will model a world where we live as creatures and not as machines, which means getting to know classmates, growing a community, and doing collective action as part of the class. There are many reasons why it's a great idea to incorporate collective action into your classroom. And we think one of the most important ones is to actually teach students the importance of social movements in fighting climate change and to show them firsthand what's possible when a group of dedicated people come together and how getting involved actually can give them agency and community. And we've done that in a few different ways. Some of them are less involved, some of them are more involved. On the less involved side, in the past, we've offered extra credit for students when they attend a general body meeting of a student organization on campus. So at any time throughout the quarter, they just have to show up, they get some sort of kind of sign-in sheet, and then if they send that back to us, they get an extra credit point. And this kind of creates an opportunity for them to experience collective action, but it oftentimes doesn't really give students the space to really explore what these organizations can do and how the people in the organizations work together. And so more recently, we've started to integrate collective action into the class actually as a kind of fixed assignment within the class, where students get paired with collective action groups on campus and need to work on some of their projects. And then lastly, we've also used these contexts to actually study what students learn and why they engage in collective action. And I'm going to show you two very quick examples of how we've done that. All right. So the first example is a published study by my friend and colleague, Brian Alam. He wanted to test whether the acquisition of knowledge and beliefs, so kind of learning about different knowledge contexts regarding the climate crisis would motivate people to act. And for this, he compared students taking this class on the psychology of the climate crisis with a control condition of just students who were not enrolled in the class, and then wanted to kind of test if their knowledge changed over time, and if any knowledge increases for the intervention condition for the students in the class would relate to how much they actually acted collectively. And so to assess knowledge, he asked participants or students in the class and the control group in week 1 and week 10, so the first and last week of the quarter, to respond to 8 open-ended questions targeting kind of different elements of knowledge about the climate crisis. So this could be, how urgent do you think combating the climate crisis is? What needs to happen to actually curb emissions, or kind of what the social and political barriers to action are? And then he used qualitative coding, or like a thematic coding approach, to assign quality scores to people's answers and to test statistically whether the answers to these different knowledge prompts would increase over time compared to the control group. And he found that for 2 out of the 8 knowledge elements, this was indeed the case. So the students in the intervention condition increased significantly in the quality of their responses compared to the control group. And those 2 elements were, 1, how much time we have left to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and whether they believed in the power of collective action to address the climate crisis. Next, he wanted to test whether these increases in these knowledge elements would actually translate or relate to the type or quality of collective action that the people did in the class. So this is focused on just the intervention condition. And so like I mentioned before, students in this class were paired with different real-world students organizations on campus, and then we measured the behaviors that they actually did kind of in the context of this pairing with the collective action group. Specifically, once a week, they were asked how many hours they spent on their collective action project, what they had planned to do, and then what they actually did. And from here, he used a very similar thematic coding approach to assign quality scores to what the students said they did. So every week, each participant received a collective action score based on the behaviors that they reported. And what's important here is that we cross-check their responses with what the other people in their group said they did. So we were able to kind of verify that what they tell us they did was actually the truth. And this is just a side note here, but this is actually a quite involved and elaborate process to address a problem in the literature of collective action, because many studies nowadays still rely on kind of measuring hypothetical intentions of engaging in certain behaviors or other kind of self-reported approximations that don't actually get at the real behavior that we're interested in. Even though we know that, for instance, there's a big gap between what you say you would like to do and what you actually end up doing. And so this is kind of a way that we developed to assess and kind of record what people actually do. And I won't go into too much detail here, but Raihan looked at a variety of different variables, including the knowledge elements that students learned about and efficacy beliefs that changed. But none of those increases actually related to the quality of the collective or of the types of collective action that students did. And this is kind of very interesting in itself, because oftentimes we think the reason other people aren't acting is because they just don't know how bad it is. They don't know enough. If they would just know about or know more about what we're up against, then they would be more motivated to act. In here, that was not the case. Okay. I wanted to show one more big example of an ongoing research project, also in this class that's very similar. So this was run a year later using a very similar design to Raihan's study, but now kind of looking more in depth at the role of climate emotions, so how people feel when taking the class, and their efficacy beliefs, so whether they think that they have kind of the ability to make a change in those groups, and how those might change over time when students are taking the class. So here again, we have students enrolled in this psychology of the climate crisis class that we're teaching. This time we split the quarter in half because we were interested in comparing kind of a time period where they had to act to get some sort of class credit, and a time period where that was already over and they could act, they were free to do so if they wanted to, but they didn't have to for the class anymore. And I don't have time to talk about that today, but and it's kind of an ongoing process of analysis, but please feel free to ask me about it if you're interested. Okay, So again, as part of this class, students were paired with real grassroots organizations from a community, and then they were given a collective action mission to work towards in small groups. And again, over the course of these collective action missions, we measured a variety of variables every week. So first, again, we assessed their real world collective action by asking them to kind of report on everything that they did. For instance, if they attended a meeting or they created social media content. And then we scored those again to assign these quality scores of how high the quality is of the action that they did every week. So very, very similar to Raihan's design. And here's just some impressions of the collective action that the students actually did. So oftentimes it was kind of social media focused kind of flyers that they designed for the different groups. And then at the same time as measuring what they did, we also measured how they felt. So their climate emotions right after attending every class, including sadness, grief, guilt, anger, anxiety, and active hope. And lastly, we also measured their self and collective efficacy beliefs right after every class. And so I'm going to quickly show you two statistical results. So this first one is about how the climate emotions change over time, as well as the efficacy beliefs. And on the x-axis, you see kind of the different assessment points, the different classes, and on the y-axis, the mean scores of the emotions. And we see that as participants go through these 6 weeks of collective action exposure and exposure to the class, their climate emotions and efficacy beliefs kind of behave a little bit differently. So we see the gap right in the middle where all the negative emotions, so anxiety, anger, sadness, grief, and guilt, significantly decrease, while the positive ones, active hope and efficacy beliefs, stay elevated. And then as a second step, we ran a GLM to try to predict participants' collective action quality scores using all of these variables that I just showed you. And we found that active hope was the only variable that significantly related to the quality of participants' actions. So the more they agreed with the statement, it's worthwhile for me to engage in collective action now as a practice for future struggles, the higher the quality of their action. And active hope actually very nicely connects us to the beginning of the talk, where I mentioned that educators often try to avoid eliciting these negative emotional responses in students. And one of the suggested ways in which we could kind of leverage negative emotions like hopelessness and anxiety is actually this idea of moving beyond kind of negative emotions as a state to emotions as a practice. And here, active hope is seen as a practice of engaging in action, not because you think that it's going to be the right thing to do, or you think it's going to help you win your issue that you're fighting against, but instead you act because it's the right thing to do. It helps you kind of flourish as a human being, connect you to other people, it prepares you for future struggles. And so here's the idea that they're kind of practicing active hope, and eliciting active hope in students might be a good strategy to motivate collective action and help them kind of accept all the negative emotions that come with learning about the climate crisis. All right, so to conclude, there are many reasons we believe why it's worthwhile and great to incorporate collective action in classroom settings. It can help you understand collective action engagement in the real world and actually help you research and study how to grow wider social mobilization around these issues. It can actually help you to provide a fuller picture of the poly crisis to the students, kind of by incorporating. We always say in the class that it's the part of the philosophy of the class and the kind of the teaching objective of the class is to actually show people what social movements can do and how important they are. You can actually support kind of student movements on campus by connecting those student groups to the different students in your class. And we've actually seen in kind of various iterations of this in the past that some of the students become kind of long-lasting active members of these different student organizations that they got to know. And then also you actually can teach students this kind of the skills and the toolkit to actually learn how to make change in society by kind of coming together and leveraging the power of people in a group. And I showed kind of these various iterations and various levels of involvement and how much hassle it is. And I would encourage all of you to kind of try out some of these approaches in your classes if you're interested. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for Pauline. That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm gonna add both of you to the spotlight here. So thank you both so much for sharing from these two very different kinds of projects incorporated into your into the classes. And I'd like to give us some time to have a little bit of a guided discussion, and also then we'll open it up for questions from the audience as well. I think the first question I'd like to ask the both of you is just what were some like challenges that came up for you in these classes, like in actually implementing these projects, either like as the people who were like doing the projects, or like challenges you noticed like the students were running into. Um, and I'd like to welcome either of you to share, what were some, like something that we might not expect, like this is actually a challenge that comes up in trying to implement something like this in a class. So.
I'll go ahead, Pauline, but I mean, again, this might be in part related to the particular students that we have at UAlbany. And one thing that shocked me is the extent to which they're so busy outside of class. I mean, so many different activities that they're doing, and many of them are working. Like I had a student giving a presentation the other day who's working a 40-hour full-time job and a part-time job on top of that, just to be able to afford her education at this state university. And so now if they're doing a project where they're trying to avoid plastic and they need to take an hour bus ride to an organic supermarket where they can kind of, fill reusable bottles with a product, or to get, particular types of, plastic-free alternatives in terms of, food or toiletries, whatever this might be. That's a real impediment for them. Same thing goes for, like, say, transportation. If you're working a full-time job, and now they're making a pledge to say ride the bus as opposed to taking Ubers or driving in the last minute. For many of them, this is a real impediment. Now, again, I think the way I focused the project was almost on, I expect that you're going to encounter challenges, and part of what we're going to do here is try to understand where these challenges are coming from and what collective action we can take to surmount them. But I'll let Pauline go, I guess.
Yeah, it's very similar for us too. It's almost also a little bit, so for us, the students oftentimes have to work in small groups. So they actually have to exchange phone numbers and start talking to each other. And we run into these same issues that probably all the other classes that require some amount of teamwork also run into, where people might be super motivated and interested, but then the barriers of kind of being able to coordinate each other and meet up, and then they're so busy outside of class, and they what kind of specifically arose for us was also that the student organizations vary in kind of how organized they are, because all the people who are part of those organizations also do it for free because they're volunteering their time. And so trying to pair the students with organizations, there's just a lot of kind of time problems and coordination issues that can arise. And then the students, every time when we introduce this idea to the students, you can just see in some of them that they're just super surprised that we're asking them to do this, because it's really uncommon. And then sometimes some of the actions involve them actually leaving campus and kind of going downtown, talking to representatives of the local government. And so I think it puts some of them a little bit outside of their comfort zone. But we try to kind of offer a big variety of actions that they can take, so everyone can find what they feel comfortable doing.
It's really cool to hear both about like things that were challenging for you. And also like it kind of reveals some of the things that you might not have expected or that surprised you going into it. So I guess building off of like challenges you encountered, or maybe just things you want to do in the future, if you were to do things differently in the future, for future iterations of, these classes, what is like one thing you might want to change or explore in the future?
And that's easy for me because it's just what Pauline was doing. And, what I learned was going on at San Diego. So I was really interested in finding ways, even if they're baby steps, to get them more involved with, collective action. The one thing I do is I don't have them visit a representative, even though we're in the state capital in Albany. So it would be certainly more viable to do this here than somewhere out in Binghamton or other state university. But I do have them, like, say, find out who their legislators are and to write a letter to the legislators. They don't have to send it. I can't ask them to do that, but some of them do. But at least to become aware, it's surprising how few of them know who even their state legislators are, and to write about an issue of concern. But I've taken some notes here on what Pauline and you all are doing at UCSD, and so that's interesting to me. So that's something I'm going to have to think about. Beyond that, I'm still getting fairly positive feedback about the project from students. Maybe they're just trying to humor me because whatever, I look pitiful and they're just trying to help me out. But so far, maybe again, there's small things I'm not going to mention to you, just about like them having difficulties finding articles that are not really about the nature of the project per se. But that's the big thing that strikes me.
I think for us, it's kind of hard because we're trying to implement this kind of collective action exercise as part of the class, but we also have to teach all of the material, and we only have 10 weeks, which is a really short quarter. And so I've just been kind of noticing that most of the students, it seems like they don't know how to kind of organize themselves, and they don't have the tools to actually say, okay, if we get tasked with this collective action project, we have to assign different roles. Who's going to be the leader, who kind of delegates, and who's going to do this, and what are the different steps that we need to take? They're kind of missing a lot of kind of education on how collective action actually works. And in the past, we've had a study where over like a period of 7 weeks, we actually built a workshop that was only focused on teaching people how to plan a collective action campaign and then how to implement them. And I wish there was a way, that's kind of what I would be hoping for the future, is to maybe take one of the 10 classes, 20 classes that we have, and actually teach them very specifically, okay, if you can pick kind of a project that's close to your heart, what's something here at UCSD that's kind of really bothering you, what's an issue that you care a lot about, and then we actually teach you how to build a campaign around it, and then maybe they'll be more equipped and more motivated to do that. Yeah.
Awesome. So, well, thank you both of you so much. It's just so exciting to think about the future and how, we can do more from here. I want to give us a chance to also have some thoughts from the audience as well. So I'm gonna take away the spotlight and I'm going to invite Mary to share.
Hi, thank you for your presentations and for your work. It's very inspiring. I do have two questions I'd like you to touch on briefly. One is, in the course of developing these projects and teaching, what has been the reactions or resistance, perhaps, from your colleagues in doing this type of work, especially when it's somewhat outside your research area? And the second question I have is, in doing this, has it helped affect your own climate worries or anxieties?
I mean, if it's okay, Pauline, I can start with the first one. The second one, I'll have to give a little more thought. The first one, no, I mean, I haven't. Maybe I'm fortunate here, but I've gotten nothing but encouragement to do this type of thing. I mean, honestly, the biggest impediment was, and this is something I'd like to express to you all. I think was just kind of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, that I'd thought about doing something like this for years and years and years, because I was doing activism and so forth, like I said, and I had meetings with climate scientists, and we were trying to imagine like, what would be the perfect course, and maybe we'll have like a kind of a pro seminar where we have people from different departments each talking about, and I've done some experiments along those lines. I think the takeaway is, do something. What I realized is, I put this together, and sure, you're going to tweak it like with any class, but if you're teaching an intro psych class, as I often do, devote one lecture, even an extra credit lecture, to the psychology of climate change. Okay, so you have Freud, and then you're going to talk about one lecture. If you're a statistics professor, so I have one that's, two doors down. Now he's starting to integrate exercises in a statistics class that just incidentally have to do with climate change. So there's just so many different ways that we can, do something here. Now, in terms of how it's affected me, you know, that's a tough one. Like I said, on a daily basis, I do feel all of those emotions that Pauline put up there on screen. I feel these things very deeply. It's very difficult. And in part, this is kind of almost a selfish project that I think I did this almost as a bit of feeling that I could do something to kind of alleviate the feelings that I had, that I'm kind of trying to use my position here as an educator to kind of to create some hope here. And I think it helps in that way. But to be honest with you, there are mixed experiences, like in other words, like, so for instance, it really hits you hard when you see, for many of the students, they have absolutely no idea. They're about to graduate, and they know very, very little about the crisis. On the other hand, you get students like I remember, I think very few times I've been teaching, 30 years or something, where I felt a tightness in my chest. I mean, I see this student who has like tears in her eyes, and she's talking about these wildfires that we had a couple of years back from Quebec, coming east, and where you couldn't go outside and the sky turned orange. And she was like, I don't think I'm going to be able to have children. I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to step outside in the summers. And, I feel that a lot of these students are, uh, I mean, they're so young and they are traumatized already. And I think things are, really getting worse in many ways. And so I think for me, it's become difficult. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you in terms of, how to handle those things. But those are some of the experiences I have with it. Generally, though, I think it has been like a positive experience overall. I think it does create some hope, some feeling of empowerment. Again, I'm not doing studies like Pauline, so I don't have data to show you. I'm not following them after they, graduate, a couple of months or even weeks in this case later. But it's a good question.
So Pauline, if
Yeah,
you want to add a little, and then we'll turn over to Anne and wrap up.
yes. I think I'll just say two very quick things. One is that I don't think there's been much resistance, but that's mainly also because my advisor who's teaching the class, his research is on climate psychology, and my PhD is on climate psychology, and so it's very fitting. I do think so. Some of the students, it's kind of hard because we kind of switched the way the class is being taught around a lot, because in the beginning it was kind of this chronological order of, first 4 weeks we would talk about the science and the impacts and the historical buildup and how did it get so bad and how did we get here. And so for 4 weeks these students would just be depressed basically, without any input of agency and what they can do and kind of what are the solutions. And so many students, I think, dropped the class because it would just be kind of a really, really, really sad experience for them. And so we didn't want to just get rid of that material because it's important to kind of convey the whole picture, but we shifted it around a lot. And so now we start with the role of social movements and how social movements have won in the past and kind of why that's important and what people can do when they get together and kind of fight for what they believe in, and then shift into some of the science and then get back to kind of, well, what are our emotions right now and how can we cope with emotions and kind of talking about our feelings. And so it's this back and forth, and I think that's been much nicer. And we also see some of the students actually there's been like a couple of students who switched to environmental law, which I think is kind of really beautiful to see, that this class actually sometimes really makes people rethink what it is they want to do. Yeah.
And if you'd like to ask our last question.
Oh, sure. Great. First, I just wanted to say I think what you're doing is great and extremely important, even though I'm sure it can get to you some of the time when you see where we are. Um, I also wanted to say, as somebody who studies resilience in young people, that these kind of strategies that that focus on efficacy, hope, agency are very important counters to where I think a lot of young people are. My question is whether you think your strategies could be adopted for high school students because they're even more depressed than college students are. Because they have more time maybe to be depressed, but the younger kids are even more concerned about what's going on. So it struck me that some of this could be adapted and might even work better in high school classes where they're like meeting regularly. But just a question. And there's a green schools movement nationwide that might be a nice partner if you ever got interested in that. So what do you think?
Well, yeah, I guess I'll go again first. I think it's a great idea. I mean, again, there are aspects of this capstone that I deliberately mentioned to you that have to do with, say, APA style and but I could easily strip most of that out and kind of keep the guts of the program for high school level students. I mean, to be honest with you, especially after COVID, our students, there's been some kind of lag. And I think a lot of, the level at which I'm approaching this project is probably different than it would have been before that cohort came in. I think so. I think it's already, I think, fairly amenable to like kind of a high school audience. If just with some tweaking. I'd never considered kind of actually reaching out to teachers or discussing that with, say, folks in our local high school, but I think they would be pretty receptive to some variants of that. I mean, so yeah, it would be interesting if we had some way of kind of reaching out to high school educators and kind of sharing ideas like this.
I completely agree. I also think because there was Fridays for Future, right? Kind of with the school walkouts, and then I think there's 350, the nonprofit organization that also specifically has kind of groups with like high school students, I believe. And so it would be really amazing to kind of envision some sort of project where those high school students actually can also kind of get hands-on collective action experience, because I think we have a lot of students in these classes, but all the other students, or a lot of them, go through their entire 4 years of undergrad education and never take a psychology class that mentions climate change and don't know many of these concepts. So yeah.
Well, fantastic. We are coming up on the hour or past the hour now, and I just wanted to thank all of you for being here, and especially to Ron and Pauline for sharing with us today. Another round of applause for you. Thank you both so much. And Jen, if there are any DevSCA reminders or announcements or anything, feel free to share.
I think this was a complete session. So thank you very much for your presentation, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next meeting.
Awesome.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Tal.
Thank you.